The views expressed in this podcast or on www.constellationspodcast.com do not officially represent the views of the U.S. military or the United States government. The appearance of U.S. Department of Defense, DoD visual information does not imply or constitute DoD endorsement.
Welcome to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos, where industry leaders share their thoughts and experience on the future of space business, policy, and opportunity. If you like Constellations, please support us by giving a rating and review on iTunes. And don't forget to share this podcast online to help our community grow.
Welcome to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos. My name is John Gilroy, and I'll be your moderator. Today, we welcome Major General Shawn Bratton, Commander, Space Training and Readiness Command, United States Space Force. We are going to talk training in the U.S. Space Force and what it will take to get everyone up and running in this new frontier. Major General Bratton, thank you so much for appearing in the podcast. We are grateful you took the time to meet with us to discuss training our Space Force and preparing them for a future readiness. As the new commander of Space Training and Readiness Command, known as STARCOM, you have your work cut out for you, don't you?
Yeah, John, hey, thanks for spending some time with me today, and I'm excited to talk to you both about STARCOM and the Space Force, but just space in general. It's an exciting time out there for the military and civil and commercial. So glad to be here today.
Tell you, the Washington, D.C. area, you get in the metro, you see all kind of teenage kids with NASA T-shirts on. And so if I tell them, hey, we're going to talk about STARCOM, we're probably getting a lot of listeners there. So what exactly is STARCOM and what is unique about its mission?
STARCOM is, as you spelled out, the Space Training and Readiness Command for the Space Force. We do all the training activities, all the education activities, but we also do test activities. I think we'll talk about that a little bit, but combined together, it really comes down to preparing the force, in this case the Space Force, for competition and conflict in the space domain, as part, of course, of that broader joint force. But we get to take them from right off the street into basic training and turn them into guardians, and that's what we do every day.
So geographically, this takes place in Colorado, or where in the United States does this take place typically?
Yeah, the command we're in multiple places. The headquarters right now is in Colorado. We have training activities in Texas and in Mississippi and out in California at Vandenberg. We have test activities at places like Kirtland and Edwards Air Force Base in California and out at Nellis. And so a lot of the places where you would see similar activities in the Air Force is right where the Space Force is. Our education activities are partnered right now both at the Air Force Academy here in Colorado as well as down in Mississippi at Maxwell. So the command is all over the country doing the work for training and education.
Well, I don't envy you. It must be some long days. Everyone is everywhere, and you're kind of the central person all this training, aren't you?
Yeah, I tell you, I don't know so much about me, but the team here at the headquarters is working hard. But I mean, I'm sure you know how it is, and your listeners know that the real work is done in the trenches for us at the squadron level, and those guys are all over the place working hard every day.
This STARCOM is a new position and ultimately a new command, not just for you personally, but as a position within the U.S. Space Force. So what is your priority here?
Yeah, it is. You're exactly right. It is a new command. We just stood up a year ago on August 23rd, and so we're coming up on a one-year birthday. And I am the first commander, so honored to be the commander of STARCOM. And it does. I mean, you got to admit, it does have the coolest name of anything in the Space Force, I think.
Oh yeah.
The priorities. Some of them were laid out. There's of course a big planning effort before I showed up, and then that I participated in when I came over from U.S. Space Command. But the priorities, some were laid out by General Raymond. So, for example, year one priority, independent professional military education for the Space Force. General Raymond really felt strongly that, hey, we need to really grow independent guardians, take the best lessons, not just from the Air Force, but from the other services, but then define our own education. So that independent, we call it PME, is the acronym for Professional Military Education, is one. But two other kind of year one priorities were building out the National Space Test and Training Complex. That's kind of our big technical challenge. It's the playground or the gym that we'll go to work out the force and try out new capabilities and new tactics and techniques, as well as just defining the Space Force's training. We get so much from our partners in the Air Force, but thinking through what things do we want to keep the same and stay partnered with the Air Force, and where are some areas where it makes sense for us to maybe start to go our own way.
General, there are people who are very familiar with the organization who are listening. There's also some people that maybe trying to learn about the Space Force. And so let me set this up just for our maybe our brand new listeners. So the Navy is to the Marines as the Air Force is to the Space Force. Is that a good way to consider it?
In some ways, yeah, absolutely. We are all in the Department of the Air Force, and Secretary Kendall, the service secretary for both the Air Force and the Space Force, and he relentlessly states one team, one fight within the Department of the Air Force. So that's our civilian leadership in the Pentagon there with Secretary Kendall, and then beneath him you have a Chief of Staff for the Air Force, General Brown, and the Chief of Space Operations, General Raymond, who is my boss. And so, we got the Pentagon leadership, similar to others, and then the next echelon or the next level down in the organization we call the field commands. There's three of them in the Space Force, and STARCOM is one of the three. We do training, education, and test, and then there's an operations command and an acquisition command, or the other two field commands.
I can't even imagine how much challenge your job must be. My wife is a teacher, and she has a master's degree in curriculum education, and she goes into established courses, and it's very difficult to do this. But you're taking and you're starting from scratch. You're building out training programs that cover multidiscipline, everything from orbital and electronic warfare to engineering and acquisitions. I mean, other than it's always been done in the past for the services, what kind of resources are you referencing and leveraging when determining the best way to build out new training and testing programs for an entire service in an area so vast and unmapped? I mean, you're the pioneer, buddy, aren't you?
I'll tell you, it's daunting, but it's super exciting to be just in on the ground floor. And first, we got to give a shout out to your wife and all the teachers. My wife's a teacher too, and I started my professional, career right out of college as a high school teacher. So I've been in the classroom, and that's my background. And so makes sense that it all comes together here to be in charge of it for the Space Force. But I'll tell you, there is a lot of new ground to break. We're really thinking through what does it mean to be a guardian, everything from the kind of culture and identity aspects and how do we impart those in training to the very technical aspects associated with space operations, and how can we benefit not just from the Department of Defense, but from what NASA is doing, what commercial companies are doing, and how do we bring some of those best practices in to the Space Force and really begin to exchange information as we grow our force, which is also, the broader workforce in the space industry.
When you look at a high school teacher, there's math courses, there's history courses, English courses. They've been taught for decades and pretty much know what's going on. In the environment you're in, it's such a dynamic environment. Things are changing almost constantly. It's like you can have just like a kind of a rough overview of what one aspect's going to be, but look at all the dynamic activity taking place with launches and new technology. I mean, we're going to the Small Sat conference here in a couple weeks, and be stuff I never dreamt happening. So you're in a position where you have to cover all the basics, and you have to have like some flexibility for the new stuff. That what's going to happen in 6 months? How can you train? You don't know, do you?
I'll tell you, it's one of the benefits I think that will prove out over time is we're such a small force. And so, there'll be about 18,000 folks in the Space Force. About half of that is uniform wearing military. That's just a fraction of the size compared to the other services, but it lets us really be agile. And so, the idea that all of the training and education falls within a single organization, STARCOM in this case, as something new happens, we can introduce it right into the curriculum. And so, for example, last year we wrote, or right at the end of the calendar year, we published a new guidelines on planning for space operations within the Department of Defense, one of our first doctrine publications for the Space Force. And as soon as, because the doctrine folks fall under STARCOM as well, as soon as that came off the presses, we turned across the room and handed it to the trainers and educators to incorporate immediately into the classrooms across the Space Force. So our small size lets us be agile like that, and we find it to be a benefit. I think our ability to respond to rapid innovation, whether within the department or in industry, will be proven out just because of that fact of our small size.
Well, let's go back to space. When a satellite is launched, I think it's placed in a specific assigned orbital slot. So will there be room set aside similarly for live testing and training? So what are some of the technical challenges you're working through right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a couple buzzwords we use in the training and the range environment. You'll hear the Pentagon staff talk about operational test and training infrastructure, and we put a label on it called the National Space Test and Training Complex. But generally, we just call it the range. How are we going to operate and test and train on a space range? And it's, as you know, it's so different than the land and sea and even air domains where you can sort of carve out some real estate, in a place like Nevada for the Nellis Test and Training Range or the National Training Center in California that the Army uses. You can declare a piece of geography set aside for test and training purposes. We certainly can't do that in low Earth orbit or in geosynchronous orbit. So we have to think about it differently. And how do we meet our test and training objectives? The things that we have to do live, how do we communicate that? And how do we think about safety and making sure our intentions are clear so no one misunderstands the activity? But also, how do we benefit from the advances in digital space? What can I do in the simulators in a digital environment so that I don't have to do it live? And how does that reference to a level of confidence that our digital models have the fidelity, for example, that to really deliver results that are accurate against live modeling? And so there's lots of folks who do this well, certainly NASA being one of those that we're trying to learn from and understand how they do test and training in the digital space and on simulators before they go live in a range-like environment.
General, I read a press release this morning, and it talked about the Space Test Enterprise Vision. So what exactly is that? Yeah, that's one of the early documents from the Space Force. We went through a series of meetings even before STARCOM stood up, really trying to both a little bit roles and responsibilities within the Space Force on who does what, as well as how can we do things, where's some innovation that we can employ, how can we speed up the process to get equipment into the hands of operators faster. And I think, one of the things the vision talks about that we hit on is what we call integrated testing. And lots of folks are trying to do this or do this well. But, historically for the Department of Defense, we do developmental testing, which has a lot to do with did the contractor deliver the thing that we asked for? Does it meet the specifications as designed? And then once a new aircraft or a new land vehicle comes online, they'll run it through operational testing, which is now we'll put it in the hands of the operators and see what they can do with it and how does it integrate into a broader architecture or set of capabilities. We're trying to combine those things into integrated tests, and the vision really speaks to how we think we'll gain advantage really in the cost and delivery portions of the acquisition process, delivery schedule. And so we're getting after integrated tests. We're putting operators and professional testers who work for STARCOM, operators who work for Space Operations Command, and then the acquirers and engineers all together in the same room to field new capabilities. Let's focus a little more on this training here. When training for a space mission, it seems that your guardians would require the realism of a contested environment. Can you train for this within a virtual reality environment? Yeah, that's a great question, and quite honestly, one of the challenges I'm wrestling with is how do I weigh the value of live training versus training in a simulator, and how do I know that one way is better than or less than the other? I had a chance to talk to a couple astronauts, and we talked through the incredible training capabilities that NASA has and employs to prepare them for their going on orbit and conducting that human spaceflight missions. It's pretty incredible the amount they do in the simulator with practicing docking, for example. And at least as relayed to me from the astronaut community was, hey, that first live dock was almost just like that last dock in the simulator. That the fidelity of the simulators and the level at which they're operating really well prepare them for live space operations. Now, that requires incredible investment in simulating and training capability, and so we're trying to balance that and understand how to measure what can we do virtually, make sure there is cost savings with it or some other benefit that we realize, and then how do we think about live training and what things absolutely have to be done live in the training environment. And so I wouldn't say that we have all the answers for sure, but we are learning from and relying on some of the experts out there and then working hard
really come down to an end state for the Space Force.
I love when you use the word fidelity. I'm old enough to remember high fidelity, hi-fi, and the idea was to have it just like the orchestra was right in the room with you, to have it right there. So what are the major considerations for creating a space training and test environment that's both digital and realistic, fidelity? I mean, are you getting help from industry, and can you give us an example?
Yeah, I'll tell you, I talk sometimes about the greatest technical challenge ahead of STARCOM specifically, and it really is this. It's the build out of the test and training complex, this weighing of value between digital and live. In the digital space, we're getting a lot of help. We're relying on other parts of the Space Force, so the Space Warfighting Analysis Center, who does a lot of our kind of architectural analysis for future systems. They begin this process where they build a digital model of a system that we might acquire in future years. As we work that through the acquisition cycle, what we hope is that once we decide that, the department decides, hey, we are going to acquire this system, that digital model gains fidelity and interaction with industry has already started. And so we're all contributing to the fidelity of the model, the accuracy of the model. Eventually, I get my hands on it, and I can use that same model that now is that kind of hi-fi element and use that for test and training. And that works great. It works great for friendly systems. And then we have to rely on the intelligence community really to, try and help us best understand what the potential adversaries are operating, what's the fidelity in their models, and then how do we bring those together in a training environment.
Major General Shawn Bratton. Thousands of people from all over the world have listened to this podcast. Go to Google and type in Constellations Podcast to get to our show notes page. Here, you can get transcripts for all 100 plus interviews. Also, you can sign up for free email notifications for future episodes. When you look at the Air Force, I think the Air Force has something called red flag exercises. And if I'm not mistaken, I think the Space Force has space flag. So how are they different anyway?
I've been to both, and they're very different. Red Flag is an incredible event. It takes place, I think, always at Nellis Air Force Base. Certainly, all the ones I've been involved. I think sometimes they do an expedition up to Alaska, but essentially it's a large aircraft live fly exercise where the Air Force and allies and the other services all come together in a single place, and then they fly multiple evolutions over, the ranges of southern Nevada, and they're presented, challenges, and then they got to fight through those challenges. And flying against them live are aggressor units that the Air Force operates that acts as the adversary, and then they do that simulated combat over Nevada. Space Flag is not that. Space Flag is, there's no live activity in Space Flag. It really is a limited use of simulation. We're using the capabilities that we have today. It's more of a planning exercise where if the adversary does this, now what will you do? We're back on, in some cases, using whiteboards and thinking through the tough problems and then being able to explain it to the leadership for the event, and then present the trainees with another challenging scenario. We are definitely trying to up our game. I don't think we'll go as far as Red Flag is and that incredible capability that the Air Force has where we would do so much live. But I think we will start to introduce maybe some more live elements in Space Flag or what the Space Force is going to go to. We'll continue to run Space Flag, but we're going to begin to run a new series of exercises that we call the Skies series. So black skies, red skies, blue skies. And each of those is for a different community. So black skies, for example, will be for the electronic warfare community. Blue skies will be for the cyber operators in the Space Force for that community, so on and so forth. And so this is a focus. We got to solve the training complex, the range problem first, so we have a place to kind of go take the force to work out and hone our skills. And then you'll see us start to use those in both Space Flag and the Sky series as that comes online over the next few years.
Earlier, I mentioned I read a press release about the Space Test Enterprise Vision. I also read a press release about the SAPR Leaders course. And in fact, there's a Guardian who graduated from the course. It seems like new terminology. Can you explain what a SAPR is?
Yeah, I'll tell you, there's always innovation in the force. And so the SAPR is really an Army program where it's the title that they call, essentially they're combat engineers. And the SAPR course is the course curriculum and the physical challenges that you go through, kind of the capstone event that you go through to be qualified as a SAPR. And so one of our guardians found out there was a way to apply, and he got permission from his commander and enrolled and successfully graduated what is a very challenging course for the Army. And so now he brings those skills back to us, and it's like, well, what are we going to do with a combat engineer qualified individual in the Space Force? But really what he brings is that understanding of, hey, what's it like to be on the ground, the experience that he got as part of the Joint Force working with the Army, and then how can space help them? Because even if we were to fight in space someday, and we certainly don't want to, just to make that point clear, but if that were to happen, we wouldn't do that by ourselves. We would have Army and Navy and Air Force and Marines helping us in that event, just like if we're fighting on the ground somewhere, the Space Force contributes to that fight. And so this pretty unique perspective that this one Guardian has and brings that back into the Space Force is pretty great. It also, quite honestly, helps us with our culture and identity. The Space Force wasn't born just out of the Air Force. We have soldiers that have come over from the Army and sailors and Marines that have come over from those services. And an experience like this really helps shape the Air Force's culture just as we're in our infancy in these early years.
This has been a great interview, General. Thanks for giving our listeners insight on the challenges in starting the new frontier of training for the United States Space Force. I'd like to thank our guest, Major General Shawn Bratton, Commander, Space Training and Readiness Command, United States Space Force.
Thanks for listening to Constellations, the podcast from Kratos. If you like this interview, please subscribe, tell a friend, and give us a review.
Hey, this is John Gilroy here. I spoke with General Bratton since we recorded the interview, and he told me he meant to say that STARCOM has training activities in Alabama instead of Mississippi. That's it. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed it.